What I've recommended to people is clean up your room.
Oh yes, that's all about cleaning your room. Have them start to clean up their external environment.
Clean that up because you can. So, can you even clean up your own room? No. It's like, I don't know how you could go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Because if you can't even clean up your own room, who the hell are you to give advice to the world?
Hey there! Recently, you may have heard about a secret leftist cabal using cultural Marxism to infiltrate Western society, hell-bent on imposing their will for their own twisted gains. Well, I'm one of those leftists, and I'm here at the nerve center of cultural Marxist activity, a university. Now, besides our modern equivalent of Jewish conspiracy theorist, racial purity-crazed neo-Nazis, the other one of two groups currently making these claims against academia are a lovely group of people called the classical liberals. One of their most prominent thinkers being a Canadian professor called Jordan Peterson. Now, as a postmodern cultural Marxist puppet of Soros, I'm obviously not too thrilled about the fact that they're onto our Marxist plot to instill the left with communism through gender or something. So I figured we'd take a look at Peterson and some other liberals today and the problems that they have with Marxist ideas.
Now, as most of you are probably already aware, Jordan Peterson is a Canadian professor of psychology who first drew attention to himself by speaking out against new laws around self-identification and preferred gender pronouns, arguing that being forced by threat of imprisonment to refer to someone by a requested set of pronouns violated his right to free speech. Of course, it wasn't by threat of imprisonment at all, he just made that up.
Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Well, then you're talking about breaking a completely different law altogether then, aren't you, Peterson?
And of course, since then he's become known for a variety of different attributes, such as his claims of cultural Marxist influence in universities, his takes on communism, and tied into his political analysis, his self-help for his fans. Now, his position on gender pronouns has already been gone through and refuted by many people, all of which much smarter than I on the topic. However, he's still got his place in the online spotlight, and he's been using this to spread many different ideas about post-modernism, cultural Marxism, and communism. One of the reasons that Peterson gained so much admiration from liberals online is that he's an intellectual with social conservative views. Yet, intellectuals today tend to be so progressive that it's almost become a derogatory term among the right. As such, someone like Peterson is readily embraced as one of the good ones. What he tends to do is add a psychoanalytical twist to what would otherwise be generic arguments against the far left, which is what makes him an interesting example for liberal arguments against communism. I mean, he's more of like a conservative than a liberal, but if the terms are interchangeable in this context, then what does that tell you?
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero.
So I guess we'll jump right into this argument about deaths under communism before getting into anything specific about Peterson, as this is what tends to be on the forefront of arguments from liberals.
Now, right away, yes. Many deaths did happen under the USSR and communist states of the 20th century. I'm not here to start claiming Western propaganda, and I'm not interested in defending these states. When we're talking about Marxism as a theory, the actions of 20th century states isn't even especially relevant. And as ridiculous as this may sound, I do implore you to bear with me. I mean, what even is Marxism? We might assume from the arguments that Peterson is making against it that it's the proposal of a new kind of society alternate to capitalism, a blueprint that, when followed correctly, leads humanity to a greater social order than before. The need for such stemming from the moral problems it points out in capitalism, like wealth inequality and worker oppression. This couldn't be further from the truth though. Marxism takes on the traits of a science in a lot of ways, not in that Marx actually wore a lab coat and messed around with vials and stuff, but in that Marxism as a theory is primarily an empirical analysis of reality, and makes general predictions based off of this analysis. I explain how exactly this is in another video on Marx's law of value that you might want to watch, but in short, Marxism is much more an analysis and description of capitalism than it is a proposal of communism. Communism is only what Marx predicted might eventually arise out of capitalism due to its own mechanisms.
As such then, pointing to attempts at communism, and they were genuine attempts, doesn't actually touch on Marx's theories, because even if revolution fails, what produced them in the first place, capitalism, still exists and will continue to produce more and more attempts over time. I actually did consider taking a read of The Gulag Archipelago, the book that Peterson consistently recommends as the ultimate refutation to communism, but I could actually give that book every single claim it makes without compromising my position, because Marxism just isn't about the performance of how revolutions do under the name of communism. Really, Peterson isn't arguing against Marxism, he's arguing against the prospects of revolutionary change to society, saying that they will always lead to totalitarian dictatorship, murder, and the like. But you see, now this is actually much more interesting than if Peterson were just talking about Marxism and communism, but rather the concept of revolution itself, because, well, Peterson's a liberal, and it's no secret that liberalism has its roots in violent revolution.
Maybe then it logically follows that it's specifically communist revolutions that always lead to totalitarian dictatorships. Maybe liberalism is just more in line with human nature than communism is, and you see, this might be a solid theory if it wasn't empirically wrong, because not all communist revolutions have led to dictatorships like in Russia, China, and North Korea. There have actually been dozens of large communist movements across the world throughout the 20th century, and some of them produced, for a small amount of time at least, pretty promising societies. They weren't the full socialist package in that they still existed within the confines of a capitalist economy, but they were looking to transition to socialism and yet still retained the elements of democracy and personal freedom more so than the societies than they had overthrown. In fact, in Syria right now today, there's a group of anarchists who reside in the region called Rojava. They have a fully democratic government structure, religious freedom, and gender equality, all while being the most effective fighting force against ISIS. Examples from history include the Paris Commune, the German communes, the Hungary communes, the revolutionary Catalonia, all societies in which, for their short existence, were as progressive and democratic as most countries are today, if not more so in some cases. Of course, what's quickly brought up in response to these examples is the fact that their lifespans were very short, ranging from a couple years and sometimes only a couple months, with every example being crushed by usually what were fascists of the time. And you know, this is a really valid point to bring up around these attempts at communism. They had their problems, but that's not what we were originally arguing. To bring up their lifespan as a response here would be moving the goalposts. What Peterson and the liberals will try and assert is that every single attempt at communism has led to bloody dictatorships, but this is just outright false. Thus, logically it follows that Peterson cannot be against revolutions on the merit that they are communist, as it's clear that dictatorship is not an intrinsic trait of a communist revolution. He must be against revolutions as a whole. However, this of course then contradicts his own position as a liberal, as of course without revolution, feudalism never would have been abolished. The question then moves to, do we need a revolution? And this is where Marx's actual theories, detached from 20th century attempts at communism, come in. Theories which Peterson has not spoken a word about. And there's a reason for this too, he doesn't understand them.
Now this is a bold assertion, I know, but let me elaborate. Later on in that clip that I showed earlier, Peterson goes on to talk about the origins of cultural Marxism, or what he's calling here Neo-Marxism. And his reasoning isn't really too distinct from what an average alt-righter might say. Communism had failed in Russia, therefore the intellectuals at the time in the West just applied Marxism to social ideas rather than economic ones, to still have a way to control society. Now, I'm not going to talk about here why postmodernism doesn't have a direct relation to Marxism, or cultural Marxism itself is just an oxymoron, because I've done that in other videos before. What I want to really focus on here is how Peterson justifies the fact that these intellectuals had to come up with these new cultural Marxist ideas, because it really shows that he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Anyways, back to the postmodern types. Well, you know, this all was revealed in such painful detail that even the kind of closed-minded ideologue that Norman referred to just couldn't quite muster up the moral courage to keep beating the same damn drum. So what they did instead, being highly intelligent individuals, was play a game of sleight of hand and transformed these Marxist presuppositions into postmodernism in the 1970s. And the idea basically was, well, the working class isn't going to rise up and crush the bourgeoisie because, first of all, they're getting rich, and that wasn't supposed to happen. And second, well, it sort of seemed to be a catastrophe when that occurred, let's say, in Russia. And so maybe we won't do that anymore because the working class actually isn't buying into this either, which is also a problem. You know, having internalized their own oppression, they wouldn't buy into this, to the global myth of utopia. So maybe it's because they had some sense. It's certainly possible. But anyways, the sleight of hand was, oh, well, fine, we'll just play a different oppressor versus oppressed game, and we'll introduce identity politics.
His theory for what spawned Neo-Marxism here had absolutely no basing. As we covered earlier, not all attempts at communism were leading to bloody dictatorships at the time, nor were people becoming disillusioned with communism due to the ones that did, like the USSR, as Peterson suggests.
Even uprisings against the USSR in the 20th century, like for instance the Prague Spring of 1968 or the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, weren't even trying to break away from the Soviet Union just to become liberal democratic states like the West. They actually wanted communism, genuine communism, which they felt the USSR was preventing them from attaining. This notion that European academics could no longer get any support from the public on communism while there were revolutions trying to attain communism is just ridiculous. But that aside, honestly, what really gets me is that Peterson's suggesting that Marxists were worried over the fact that the working class was getting rich.
Now, to suggest that this is a contradiction in the theory in any way really reveals the lack of understanding Jordan Peterson has, and I really want to push this point because his fans think he's an intellectual. Yet, if he had just bothered to read one work by Marx, say, I don't know, Wage, Labour and Capital, then he'd know that Marx fully expected the working class to get rich. He just also expected the gap in wealth between the working class and the capitalist class to also increase, which it did. Let's take a read, shall we? The more quickly the capital destined for production, the productive capital, increases, the more prosperous industry is, the more the bourgeoisie enriches itself, the better business gets, so many more workers does the capitalist need, so much dearer does the worker sell himself. The fastest possible growth of productive capital is, therefore, the indispensable condition for a tolerable life to the labourer. And then on the next page, if capital grows, the mass of wage labour grows, the number of wage workers increases. In a word, the sway of capital extends over a greater mass of individuals. Let us suppose the most favourable case. If productive capital grows, the demand for labour grows. It therefore increases the price of labour power, wages. A house may be large or small. As long as the neighbouring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The little house now makes it clear that the inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one. And however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighbouring palace rises in equal or even in greater measure, the occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more comfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his four walls. A rise in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. A rapid growth of productive capital calls forth just as rapid a growth of wealth, of luxury, of social needs and social pleasures. Therefore, although the pleasures of the labourer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which they are inaccessible to the worker in comparison to the stage of development of society in general. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society, we therefore measure them in relation to society, we do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratification. Since they are of social nature, they are of relative nature. But that was a lot there, and it touches on a lot of concepts, so I'm sorry about that. But the core point to take away is that Jordan Peterson is fucking wrong, doesn't understand what he's talking about.
This is only one of two instances I could really find where Peterson tries to refer to Marxist theories specifically, rather than regarding to general communism. Now, to be fair to Peterson and our claim that he doesn't understand basic Marxism, or at the very least intentionally misrepresents it for political gain, we'll take a moment to brush through this other short argument he's made too.
Because one of the things that made Marx wrong was Marx believed that capital would flow into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that the dissociation between the rich and the poor would become more extreme as capitalism developed. And like so many things that Marx said, it's kind of true. It's kind of true in that the distribution of wealth, and in fact the distribution of anything that's produced, follows a Pareto pattern. And the Pareto pattern basically is that a small proportion of people end up with the bulk of the goods. And it isn't just money. It's anything that people produce creatively ends up in that distribution. The reason that Marx was right was because he noted that as a feature of the capitalist system. The reason that he was wrong is that it's not a feature that's specific to a capitalist system. It's a feature that's general to all systems of creative production that are known. And so it's like a natural law, and it's enough of a natural law, by the way, that the distribution of wealth can be modeled by physical models using the same equations that govern the distribution of gas molecules in a vacuum. So it's a really profound, it's a fundamentally profound observation about the world, way the world lays itself out. And it's problematic because if resources accrue unfairly to a small minority of people, and there's a natural law-like element to that has to be dealt with from a social perspective, because if the inequality becomes too extreme, then the whole system will destabilize. And so you can have an intelligent discussion about how to mitigate the effects of the transfer of creative production into the hands of a small number of people. Now, the other reason, however, having said that, the other reason that Marx was wrong, there's a number of them. One is that even though creative products end up in the hands of a small number of people, it's not the same people consistently across time. It's the same proportion of people. And that's not the same thing.
So first off, what we need to deal with here is Peterson's notion of what capital is. It would seem that Peterson's simply referring to capital as money, but this wasn't Marx's definition at all, and if you're gonna be arguing against a theory, it's fair to say you need to use the same definitions. For Marx, capital is any resource or means of production used to increase its own exchange value by having labor done on it. When Marx talks about capital accumulation, he's talking about these resources, these tools, becoming concentrated in the hands of fewer people. And this is due to the intricate inherent laws of markets. Wealth accumulation on top of this is merely a consequence, but it's not what Marx was directly referring to. I bring this up because it's a very basic aspect of Marxism that you'd expect an intellectual to know, but anyway. His main point is that apparently this accumulation applies to everything in society that gets created. I'm almost tempted to ask, so what? Marx never said this wasn't the case, but obviously the implied argument here is that you can therefore never amend capital accumulation because, as Peterson says, it's a natural law, meaning the prospects of communism and equality are impossible. But you see, communism isn't about equal distribution of capital, it's about the abolition of the very concept of capital. As I've said, capital is anything used to increase its own exchange value, but exchange value itself is a product of a commodity-based society, and these are all things which communism exists without. So I don't really see why it matters if other aspects of society accumulate, because they're not what Marx ever talks about, or things that communism aims to alter. There are relevant aspects to the theory. Lastly, there's this notion that actually wealth accumulation is okay because the specific individuals change who actually own that wealth, but again, this is not something related to Marx's theory in the slightest. Marx just wanted to explain what happens and why it happens. He doesn't care if you swap out the individuals involved because it's a systemic analysis. Peterson proves Marx right the second he admits that wealth accumulation exists. Of course, he either has no idea of this himself or is just hoping you don't realize this as he makes a seemingly profound point about Marx that actually holds no content at all.
Now sure, he may be an expert in psychology, but in regards to Marxism, he either needs to just read a book or fucking stop. It becomes fairly obvious fairly quickly that psychology is all Peterson really knows anything about. As you'll see, he tries to drape all of his political positions in this thin veil of psychoanalysis, often trying to meld his self-help points to wider society.
Consider the youthful activist making a statement against the corrupt capitalist system by smashing in the storefront of a local business. What has he done other than to bring harm to people who have nothing to do with his real problems? The guilt, doubt, and shame he will inevitably feel in consequence will have to be suppressed, so his beliefs can remain unchanged. And that suppression will do nothing but foster his anger and alienation.
Admittedly, though, this does allow him to make much more striking and scientific analysis of some areas, such as
And not so
With the
infrequently.
feminists, it's got to be because Muslims right now are higher up on the victim hierarchy than them. So even if it's way over there, they're not allowed to speak out against it.
I think it's their unconscious wish for brutal male domination.
Really, Peterson? Fucking really? You've just taken this out of poll. This is an argument that you've taken straight out of poll. Just stop. Just stop it.
In fact, most of the time whenever he talks about Marxism, his points have zero relation to anything Marx has ever said. And not even in the sense of misunderstanding Marx like we talked about earlier, but objectively not criticisms of a theory. Rather, he tends to use it as a tool to further his attacks on general progressives, which, despite what he and other classical liberals may tell you, often have very little to do with Marxism. He uses his psychoanalysis to talk about the progressive mindset and try and compare it to the communist revolutionary one, making out progressives to naturally turn into the same communists as seen in history through great leaps in logic. Essentially, what he does with this sleight of hand trick is manage to pin the weight of deaths caused under the name of communism to today's liberal progressive movement. They think in the exact same way and are just as power hungry as the Bolsheviks were 100 years ago, and if we don't stop them right now, then we'll have Soviet Russia and collectively owned toothbrushes all over again. And you want to know what the best part here is? That's me trying and failing to exaggerate Peterson's views here, because this is actually what he believes.
Okay, so now I have to use a certain terminology. So then I look at the derivation of the terminology. I say, oh, that's terminology generated by the postmodern neo-Marxists. Oh, well, I think those people are reprehensibly murderous. So guess what? I'm not going to say their words, period, because I know what they're like. I know where that leads.
That's right, guys. All we needed to achieve communism all along was just have people use correct gender pronouns.
My point here is that I guess Peterson never really tries to come up with specific arguments against communism because he never really intends to. I don't think Peterson really sees Marxism itself as an ideology that really needs to be opposed today, more as a useful boogeyman that he can bring into the discourse whenever talking about progressives, via be it repackaging what once were right-wing conspiracy theories into the mainstream like cultural Marxism, or just scaremongering about past communist revolutions like all liberals and conservatives do, while then advocating for the perpetuation of society built on the foundation of violent revolution. Pure ideology, guys. One thing that I do kind of find funny about Peterson and the classical liberals in general, actually, is that they dedicate themselves so much to attacking communism and the progressives that they themselves kind of become the personification almost of the actual establishment line around radically changing society. Him and his whole group end up being the unwitting mouthpiece for the establishment ideology, while at the same time trying to frame themselves as these edgy outsiders against political correctness. They take the most benign issues to stand against, get to think of themselves as these edgy, free-thinking badasses, while at the same time then taking the most conservative and moderate positions possible on anything that actually matters, like, for instance, the fundamental foundations of our society.
Peterson really is the embodiment of the predominating neoliberal ideology here, otherwise known as the establishment. He and the rest of the classical liberals continually claim that they're anti-establishment in one instance, while regurgitating Cold War propaganda and buying into the perpetuated mindset that it's irrelevant how bad our society may seem now, as every other alternative is some form of bleak totalitarianism in the next. It's exactly what the modern liberal propaganda of today indulges in, as any conservatism around radically changing society can hardly be justified by trying to emphasize how good our current society is. In fact, anyone out of touch enough to do so is instantly taken advantage of by populist movements, because no one wants to hear that this is as good as it gets. This point is elaborated on brilliantly in Capitalist Realism, with a quote from some French guy who I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but is not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda. Further on from the quote, it adds the brilliant comparison to this predominating message with the mindset of a depressive. Hope is a dangerous illusion. I make this point to highlight that while Peterson and these classical liberals so often consider themselves to go against the grain in fighting the evil political correctness of feminism, they're so often just mouthpieces of the establishment on any real issues that actually matter.
I mean, fuck guys, if you're gonna spread bullshit to benefit someone else, at least make sure you're getting paid for it. I mean, we at the left, we at least have Soros.
Thing that I've said to people has become this crazy internet meme, but that's to clean up your room. And
But you know, classical liberalism extends beyond just Peterson and some random nerds on the internet. In a more abstract sense and treated as an ideology, classical liberalism's arguments against communism derive from two main books. The Gulag Archipelago, which we've already mentioned as to why we won't be covering here, and more interestingly, The Road to Serfdom.
Aha! What's that? Through my tactical clickbaiting of a controversial popular figure, I managed to lure you into a video that's actually talking about a book that's almost 100 years old and why it's wrong. Of course, things kind of got away from me a bit there. I mean, that's what I was going to do, but we've ended up talking about Peterson for most of the video now. But we're going to talk about the book anyway, because by God, if you're here by this point, you're not going anywhere anyway. So ages ago, I actually made a deal with Sargon of Akkad over Twitter DMs that if I read The Road to Serfdom, he would read The State and Revolution. And I actually got about halfway through the book at the time, and I don't imagine he ever really started on his, but now that both of our accounts from the time of being banned, any prospects of accountability are long gone. But I do remember when I was initially reading the book, I may as well make something productive out of the time I was spending and make a video out of it, talking about the book. And well, many months later, and then 20 minutes about bitching about some Canadian professor, here we are.
The Road to Serfdom is a book written by Hayek, made to warn about the dangers of socialism. What makes it interesting is just how many parallels you can draw between what this book says and what modern liberals like Peterson say. The first sentence of the first chapter is, "When the course of civilization takes an unexpected turn, we blame naturally everything but ourselves." Not only is this obviously reminiscent of Peterson's application of self-help to wider society, but it's further development into a wider point that touches on, in my opinion, a fundamental flaw in how liberals view societal trends. It's something I'm sure you've all heard before, especially in regards to Antifa and the rise of the alt-right, and I think it could be referred to as hyper-individualism in regards to interpreting social trends. Now, while obviously as a leftist I already think that individualism is a scourge of society to the point that I'm coming for that fucking toothbrush, but the individualist method of thinking about society and the individual values are distinctive. Now, usually liberals think of society in terms of just a collection of individuals making choices, which it is, but what they then go on to say from that just aren't useful conclusions. When analyzing societal trends like, say, violent protest, the typical liberal response is usually something like, well, these people should just realize that it doesn't solve anything and hurts their own movements when they do violence. They take the hyper-individualist approach to things and have everything come down to the individual rational choice of those involved. But the occurrence of violent protest is something we see crop up again and again throughout the decades. It gets a bit ridiculous to say that it's all the result of just individuals making bad choices, and instead it makes much more sense to start making general rules about the currents seen in society to better explain why things happen. This abstracts the whole situation and removes the individual, and for some reason, liberals don't like this. But it's actually the very same principle applied to any scientific theory.
Now, take for example the theory of an ideal gas. Focusing in on every individual atom, there'd be no way to make any meaningful distinction or measurement about what's happening in the box. But if you start scoping out and look at millions or billions of atoms all constantly interacting, you can start to make general laws about the behavior of the gas. So when you examine the system as a whole, you're able to derive useful rules about what's happening rather than on individual atoms. And these laws don't apply perfectly, but they're still very useful general trends that we can kind of use to predict what's going to be happening to a pretty good degree. Now, bear with me, but Society is kind of similar, and really liberals need to see this because they apply this line of hyper-individualism to so many aspects of society. It's the same thing when they blame higher crime rates among black people on just black people deciding to do crime more often. But again, you can't just pin societal trends on individual action, because societal trends imply that there's a dimension above individual action. It's like saying that this gas just follows these laws because each individual atom just decides to follow the general trend. No, stop it. We have millions of people making millions of decisions, and sometimes these decisions follow trends, implying that there's something causing people to make the choices that they do, rather than everyone just deciding it's a great idea to smash up windows, or, as Hayek seems to think, everyone just decided populism was great, and that's why World War II happened. But just to clarify, this doesn't excuse people from their own individual responsibility. Explaining why people do certain things doesn't excuse them from what they've done, as liberals will often try and conflate.
Now, the road to serfdom is generally meant to be an attack on the workings of communism and how it will inherently lead to dictatorships. Of course though, the book has more or less nothing to do with communism, but rather centrally planned economies. In fact, all the arguments of the book could simply be avoided by saying, well, I think a different method to central planning should be used to get us to socialism. But of course, then I'd be ending the video right here and we wouldn't have any fun, so we'll deal with the arguments themselves. However, due to the strong emphasis placed on central planning, it has led a lot of liberals to associate the concept of communism as a whole to central planning. But how does it really relate to communism? Well, here's the thing. Marx himself never really spoke about specifically central planning. If you know much about Marxism, you'll know that there isn't really much time dedicated to talking about what a socialist society might look like, or even a transitional phase from capitalism to socialism. This isn't due to any kind of neglect though. It's because one of the reasons Marx proposes that socialism might arise out of a capitalist crisis is because it's what will immediately make sense to the people living through that crisis. People are influenced heavily by the material conditions that they live under. And it's the material conditions that spawn socialist movements and spread socialist ideas that capitalism seems to perpetually reproduce. It follows then that the formation of such a society has to as well come from what people of the time find intuitive based on their situation. And something like that is so contextual that it's simply impossible to explain in detail how it will pan out. Marx only ever goes as far to develop the idea of labor vouchers because he's convinced that such a system will be the one thing that seems most immediately obvious to go by for people under socialism at first. Central planning then is just a product of its time. It's not a set-in-stone plan that Marx laid out for those seeking socialism. It's what arose out of the early 20th century communist movements in response to the material conditions they were faced with. In countries where central planning was prominent, these conditions were of course crippling lack of industrialization and remnants of a feudalist system existing in a budding capitalist one. It should then follow that to assume central planning is still just as relevant to today as it was 100 years ago, let alone that it is the only available option for modern socialists, is absurd. Now, don't get me wrong though, I'm not saying that actually Marx would have been fine with market-based systems bringing about socialism. Planning of some nature will of course be utilized, and this was in fact talked about by both Marx and Engels. What I'm trying to highlight though is that the nature of this planning is not in one set form. It all depends on the conditions we're faced with at the time of revolution, and talking in length about them now just isn't possible.
This is why I personally believe that socialists shouldn't be laying out plans for us to follow step by step on how to attain socialism, because it limits ourselves to past methods and doesn't give us any room to come up with ideas specific to our own time. This is all a topic for another time though. The main takeaway is that communism and central planning are synonymous, and for all we know, the next time around, central planning may not even make any sense to use. And when you consider that its main objective was rapid industrialization, and we mostly live in a post-industrial society, even the third world is industrialized, I don't think it's that out there to suggest that it might be the case. Of course though, with all of this aside, it's still worth looking at how Hayek got central planning wrong in his book, so we're going to be doing that as well. Now Hayek tries to explain that over time, any democratically run central planning will inherently lead to dictatorship in the following paragraph. The goal of planning will be described by some such vague term as the general welfare. There will be no real agreement to the ends to be attained. Democratic assemblies cannot function as planning agencies. They cannot produce agreement on everything. the whole direction of the resources of the nation, for the number of possible courses of action will be legion. There will be greater and greater demand for some board or some single individual should be given powers to act on their own responsibility. The cry for an economic dictator is a characteristic stage in the movement towards planning. The whole system will tend towards that kind of dictatorship in which the head of government is from time to time confirmed in his position by popular vote, but where he has all the power at his command to make certain that that vote will go in the direction that he desires. So let's break this down point by point. What he essentially does is set up a dichotomy between direct democracy and dictatorship, and affirms that direct democracy would be too slow and inefficient to properly organize central planning. And, on this point, I agree with him, which is why I would advocate for representative democracy. And his response to this notion is really interesting in that he essentially accidentally argues against liberal democracy. Now, he says that a representative in central planning would have so much power that they'd be able to make a democratic vote go in whichever way they wanted. Why he assumes that a representative would have control over the whole state, and furthermore, as well as that, the most important part in influencing democracy, the media, is beyond me, because no one is advocating for that. However, what does large amounts of influence and resources being used to, let's say, manufacture consent remind you of? That's right, what Hayek said would happen under central planning is exactly what we live under today with liberalism. The pseudo-elections, where the same group of people, regardless of the outcome, have their interests served. The large-scale economic situation largely remaining constant. You can kind of say that Trump is an exception to this, in a weird way, but also kind of not. But that's a completely different topic that we're not going to get into now. What's important is that he's an exception to the rule that Hayek just outlined as the inevitable consequence of central planning.
Now, funnily enough, when Hayek repeatedly asserts that socialism will bring an end to democracy, he's actually right in a way that he isn't aware of. While the transitional phase to socialism is in theory and has shown to be in practice more democratic than liberal democracies, the actual socialist or communist society itself does indeed abolish democracy. But in the sense that it abolishes politics and the act of one group exerting its will upon another in society in any way possible. The anarcho-capitalists will often talk about this too, although their alternative can only ever be the dictatorship of private property. In The State and Revolution, Lenin spends some time talking about this concept, clarifying on views expressed by Engels. In conventional arguments about the state, the mistake is constantly made, which is exposed in the warning by Engels. Namely, that it is constantly forgotten that the elimination of the state also involves the elimination of democracy. That the withering away of the state means the withering away of democracy. At first sight, such an assertion seems extremely strange and incomprehensible. Someone may indeed begin to worry that we are expecting the advent of a social order wherein the principle of the subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed. For does not democracy mean the recognition of just such a principle? No. Democracy is not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority. Democracy is a state which recognizes the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e., it is the organization for the systemic use of violence by one class against another, by one section of a population against another. We set ourselves the ultimate aim of abolishing the state, i.e., all organized and systemic violence, all use of violence against people in general. We do not expect the advent of a social order wherein the principle of the subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed, but in striving for socialism, we are convinced that it will develop into communism, and that, in the connection to this, the need for violence against people in general, for the subordination of one person to another, of one section of the population to another, will vanish altogether, since people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination. In order to emphasize this element of habit, Engels speaks of a new generation, which has grown up in the new free social conditions capable of throwing away all the rubbish associated with the state in all its forms, including the democratic republican state.
I'm bringing this point up because it shows how deep communism goes beyond Hayek's, quite frankly, vulgar understanding. Now, it is worth noting that it is Lenin who's talking here, and I don't 100% agree with everything that he says on socialism, but really what he's doing here and why I used it is he's making an Engels quote simpler to understand and elaborating on it, I think, in quite a nice way, which is why I think it was good.
This brings us on to Hayek's arguments for individualism. And we see here an argument brought up so much in the modern day that you can see why I've just decided to say fuck it and go straight into the source. So of course, it's private property that is pointed out to be the source of individual freedom in society. I quote, "Our generation has forgotten that the system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that we as individuals can decide what to do with ourselves. When all of the means of production are vested into a single hand, whether it be nominally that of society as a whole or that of a dictator, whoever exercises the control has complete power over us. In the hands of private individuals, what is called economic power can be an instrument of coercion, but it is never control over the whole life of a person. But when economic power is centralized as an instrument of political power, it creates a degree of dependence scarcely distinguishable from slavery. It has been well said that in a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation." So a few things right off the bat about this quote. You'll notice today that Hayek employs the same rhetoric that Peterson and the establishment do today of, our system isn't perfect, but it's the best we've got. Secondly, it's incredibly ironic that Hayek is so deeply concerned with people being able to oppose a system without starvation, while then advocating capitalism, a system in which your own livelihood is dependent on your ability to sell your own labor power. This is all just nitpicking though. The actual meat of the argument is that private property disperses power across society and then by extension nullifies political ability to strip us of our individual freedoms, while central planning results in political expansion into every aspect of human life, much like the pre-stated goal of Mussolini's fascism. What Hayek seems to think here though is that the limits of individual freedoms can only come from the conscious actions of other individuals. Rather, instead, what we see under private property is a systemic restriction on freedom. Capitalism, out of historical necessity as it arises out of feudalism, relies on the majority of the means of production belonging to a minority. This is not crony capitalism, this is just how capitalism has been since the Industrial Revolution and how it has consistently remained until today. The reasons for why this has to remain in this way is rather nuanced, but a simplified explanation is that capital relies on wage labor in order to perpetuate it. Wage labor, however, is the act of selling your labor power as a commodity to an owner of means of production and capital, a capitalist. In order for this dynamic to be perpetuated though, it's obvious that the worker has to not be able to attain their own means of subsistence from elsewhere, or they wouldn't have the need to go to work for both their own means of subsistence and that of their employer. To get around this then, the only solution is that there is one class of society that owns the means of production, and then a majority class society that does not own any means of production, and as such only has one way to sustain themselves. This isn't just limiting on freedom by eliminating the worker's choice to work for themselves, but it also forces them to work for longer, under conditions they don't control, under the authority of somebody else. This is the necessary consequence of private property under capitalism, and to suggest that it is somehow a freer society compared to the means of production being held in common by all of those who work them democratically is ridiculous. I of course talked about the subject of democracy earlier. The phrase democratic ownership as such only really applies to the lower phase of socialism. Democracy is still more free than dictatorship though, even if the ultimate goal is to move beyond that.
Hayek's criticism then of communal ownership is that it will somehow expand into all spheres of life, personal and political, without really explaining how. He just affirms it by pointing to examples like the USSR and fascism. But as we've already dealt with here, trying to critique socialism by pointing to past examples like this doesn't really count as a valid argument. So that's the road to serfdom, or at least most of the arguments it makes against socialism. Of course it makes more, but this video is stupidly long as it is, and I feel like the ones we cover are the most interesting ones anyway. As for what I think of it as a whole, obviously, you may have guessed from the video, I quite heavily disagree, but I also have to say that while I have been pointing back to the whole not true socialism argument quite consistently in this video, whenever Hayek tries to affirm his arguments by pointing to the USSR or other places, I'm kind of sympathetic to Hayek in a way when he does this. Because I feel like the true intention of the book isn't as such meant to be an all-encompassing refutation of communism like it's presented, but more a word of warning against what Hayek was seeing in his own time, when he actually did look at the USSR or Nazi Germany, which he considered both to be variations of socialism, even if he was wrong there. And honestly, I can kind of understand that. Even if I do still hold major disagreements with him on how he thinks society should be run. Of course, the problem is, though, he does kind of refer to the USSR as the inevitable outcome of all socialist projects, which we've gone over why that just isn't true. And many conservatives and liberals alike today will hold this book up as an encompassing refutation of socialism, and, well, when that's how it's held up, it needs to be treated as such. Had Hayek taken the Gulag Archipelago approach, and simply talked about specific authoritarian societies that existed in his time, I feel like he'd have a lot more ground to stand on. I don't think he'd be right, necessarily, in a lot of ways, but again, I could definitely see where he's coming from and be much more sympathetic to him that way. Because then it just comes down to an argument over historical facts and what you want to consider Western propaganda and what isn't. And it loses its edge as a critique of the whole communist ideology and instead just specific societies. Most, if not all, arguments against Marxism by Peterson, Hayek, and classical liberals in general, really, only ever really deal with the concept of revolution or central planning themselves. But Marx doesn't even set up some dichotomy between market-based capitalism and planning. To Marx, planning can be just as capitalist as traditional capitalism is. In fact, Marx wants to go further and abolish the concept of economics altogether. It just so happens that central planning has historically been one method on how to attain socialism. But Marx himself never really spoke about it. It should have become clear by now that liberals don't really have much to say on the socialist society itself, but rather say it's an unattainable goal due to the inherent corruptibility of humans. We've dealt with these arguments, but what do liberals propose as an alternative to this then? They rally behind the inhuman market system, which is supposedly immune to such temptations of power because no one's in charge of it. What they unknowingly hold up as their best model of society is actually the prime target for Marx's criticisms, and they know this if they actually understood it. The market, while a collection of human exchanges, has no human will of its own. It's a faceless entity perpetuated by collective exchanges in society. No one disagrees with this, and it's why liberals will nominate it to be the driving force of our economy as opposed to planning. It's why they think it will provide us with the most individual freedom, because it's a collective of human exchanges which, on their own, have no power. Now, on the face of it, this may seem to make sense, but what we then have as the sum total of these powerless individual actions, it's a supreme power over society which society has no control over. Thus, we're left with the suspension of our individual freedoms, but because it's not carried out by any one specific individual, not even the capitalists themselves to a fundamental level, the liberals tell us that this is actually the highest degree of freedom. Because anything we're restricted from by capital, they assume to be a fact of life, rather than a direct result of our society being dictated by capital. And I was gonna talk about, Marx's commodity fetishism and values of social force from this point on, but no, this video is already stupidly long. We don't have time for that. If you're still watching by this point, I kind of have to ask, what the fuck is wrong with you? But if you are genuinely interested, I will make a video at some point. I do recommend just reading a book, but maybe I'll get Sonia. We'll do another animation thing like we did with the Law of Value or something. But we'll probably dedicate another 20 minutes to this topic to do it justice, honestly. But I was gonna do just a witty skit here at the end to tie up the video all nicely. But if you're still here, you don't give a shit about any of that. I just needed the skits to hook everyone in at the beginning. But if that's what you needed to watch, then you're gone by this point anyway. So yeah, I think we're done here.